bit about, I guess, midweek, and I was able to be in the San Antonio area last Sunday for worship and enjoyed meeting some new people in that part of the world. But it is very good to be back here with you today. Welcome to our guests. We appreciate you joining us, being here with us. We always welcome here. If we can serve your spiritual needs in any way, let one of us know. This is a special place with good people who love God, love you, love one another. We want to serve you and help you get home to heaven yourselves. Thank you for being here with us this morning. Thanks to Jim for reading out of 1 Peter 4. This book that Peter wrote has, for me at least, the last 4 or 5 years, and really the last 2 or 3 years, I've kind of developed a new appreciation for this epistle. And I found myself this week reading through most of the entire epistle, just getting ready for this lesson. And I want to share with you a few things before we dive into the main part of the lesson, which will be over verses 4 through 7 today, as we talk about spiritual service. I don't know how many of you remember, but 1 Peter is a book that is written to Christians that are under pressure. They are experiencing all kinds of problems. They are experiencing persecution. They are dealing with issues. And as you go through, you kind of get hints of this through the book. First of all, they had suffered from being moved around involuntarily throughout the Roman Empire. Peter calls them exiles of the dispersion. He says in chapter 1 and verse 6 that they've been grieved by various trials, and then he says in the next verse that their faith had actually been tested by fire. They were dealing with being maligned, they were dealing with being persecuted, they were dealing with some of them being killed for the gospel of Jesus Christ. He goes on to say in chapter 2 that they were maligned and slandered against, and then he says in chapter 3 that they had suffered evil and reviling. So they were dealing with a lot. And a lot of times when you go through situations like that, the pressure's growing. In fact, I would tell you this, over the next Christians would really have to deal with a lot of persecution. Martyrdom is something that's going to be commonplace for them. And so the apostles and those who would labor after them worked very hard to make sure the Christians understand who they were and who Christians are as we have this relationship with Jesus Christ. Notice as you go through the book, one of the things Peter does is he stresses the identity of these Christians. They need to know who they are. They need to know the relationship that they have with Jesus Christ. He says you're elect exiles. He says you are obedient children. He calls them living stones and a holy priesthood that are being built up into a spiritual house. In chapter 2 and verse 9, he calls them a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, and a people for God's own possession. Later, he calls them sojourners and exiles. And I want you to hold on to that, because we'll be coming back to that later in the lesson here, that especially those two specific terms in detail. Later in the chapter, he calls them servants. And then going on, he talks more and more about this. And so they needed to know who they were. And then he reminds them and he encourages them throughout the book. He talks about a living hope. And these are Christians that are on to an inheritance that is imperishable. And they're being held and guarded by who? By God. And that's, of course, by their faith. And later he says, you are a people who have received mercy. These are powerful passages where he talks about how they are going to be encouraged and they can get through all of this. Going into chapter 3, he reminds them that God's ears are open to their prayers. And then later he says that if you suffer for the sake of righteousness, you're going to be blessed. And so with this, they are encouraged to remain faithful. For example, going back to chapter 1, they were told to set their hope fully on the grace of God that be revealed when Jesus returned. They're told to lead a holy life. They're told to put malice and deceit and slander. They're told to abstain from the passions of the flesh. They're told to be subject to the human institutions and to demonstrate honor to everyone, to be like Jesus, to be a blessing to others, and to live for the will of God. I mean, it's just amazing as you go through this epistle. It's a short epistle. In fact, you could read through the entire 5 chapters of 1 Peter in probably 10 to 15 minutes. And as you go through, it's just rich, it's powerful. There are things there that we can take and apply to our own lives today. In fact, if you were going to summarize 1 Peter in 3 ways, 3 sections, you could do it in this way. He talks about, basically 1 Peter is a book that's written on reasons to remain faithful. The first section is you have a great and precious salvation. The second section is that you have been called to exemplify Jesus in every circumstance, with the government, with your work relationships, in your marriage, with your family. That whole section through the middle of the book talks about it in this regard. And then finally, the last part of the book, one reason that we need to remain faithful is that Jesus is coming again. And we'll see that very in depth here in just a few moments. But this is a great way to break down the epistle of 1 Peter into 3 sections. Why Christians need to remain faithful. Now, what does all of this have to do with what we're talking about today? Well, in our lesson today, we are going to be looking primarily at the first part of the last section of the book. We're going to be talking about remaining faithful to God while living with constant expectancy of the return of Jesus Christ. When Jim read from 1 Peter 4, 7 through 11 a few minutes ago, that passage could be summarized as God's charge to us as we lead holy lives while living in a sinful world. Basically, this whole section, from verse 7 to verse 11 in chapter 4, is a very complex explanation of what the faithful Christian life looks like. And if you go through your bulletin today, if you look on the last page of the bulletin, there's an outline there that you can take out and use as we go through the lesson. You'll notice the main bullet points out of the lesson kind of outline this whole section that we're going to be talking about. And it really divides into 3 ways. Verse 7, we're going to be talking about the catalyst for faithful living. Verses 7, the second part of verse 7 through the first part of verse 11, we're going to be talking about directions for faithful living, and then we'll wrap up the section by looking at the end of verse 11, talking about the purpose for faithful living. So this is how our section breaks down today as we study together, talking about good stewards of God's grace. So let's get going. Are you ready? Let's start here in verse 7. Let's first begin by talking about the catalyst for why we lead faithful lives as God's sons and daughters. And I want to put verse 7 back on the screen for you now. Notice what Peter says. The end of all things is at hand. And I just want to stop right there, and I want to focus on that for just a minute. The end of all things is at hand. What is Peter talking about when he uses the term there, the end? Well, as you think about that term, I want you to think about consummation, not cessation. When you go back into the original language, you begin to find that word end there, because I think typically we look at that and we think, well, it's the end, it's finished, it's over. And in other words, this meaning of this word is more talking about fulfillment. The goal has been attained. Things are coming to pass. We might use it in the way of talking about culmination or realization. And notice here he says the end of all things. The end of all things here is talking about the return of Jesus. That is exactly what he's talking about here. And then he says the end of all things is at hand. That simply means to come near or to approach or to be on the point of. It's talking about things as they move forward and not things that are not off too far in the distant future. And the message here is that the end could happen at any moment. Now, I want you to make the personal application for this. The teaching here, brothers and sisters, is very simple. There is an expectancy for Christians to be living with the idea that Jesus could be here before the end of the day. And if he doesn't come today, he could be here tomorrow. If he doesn't come after that, he could be here by the end of the week or whenever it is. The idea is expectancy that Jesus could return at any moment. Now, another passage I want us to look at is 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, and I want to look at verses 9 and 10. Now, verse 10 is the one that we're going to focus on, and then make some application. But Peter talks about the faith of the Thessalonian brethren. He says that they turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God, and now what do? Now, because they have begun to serve the living and true God, he says, and now you are to wait for his Son from heaven. Just stop with that for a second. Christians, wait on the return of Jesus from heaven. Let me ask you this. How much does the possibility of the return of Jesus Christ factor into your daily life? I want to stop here for just a second and really get us to think about it. Can I truly say that I am waiting on the return of Jesus Christ? And a few moments ago, I touched on chapter 2 and verses 11 and 12 of 1 Peter, where he calls those Christians sojourners and exiles. And this really fits in nicely here, because if you're waiting on Jesus to return from heaven, how does that impact your life here? Just think with me for a moment. If you know and you know that your existence is temporary, that you're only going to be here for just a little bit, how does that affect your attachments here? How does that impact the perspective of your life? Soon to be 25 years ago, Becky and I moved from Arkansas to Brownsburg, Indiana for the first time, and I moved there to work in an intern program with Carl McMurray. And I remember moving up there, and it was a big deal for Becky and me. We'd just been married about a year, and we were moving 650 miles from home, everything we'd always known. It was way up north. It was cold for the summer instead of hot like we had down in Arkansas. Everything was different. But I will remember this, when we moved in and we had all this stuff, big moving truck, I remember the people saying, boy, you guys have got a lot of stuff. Boy, you guys are only going to be here for a year. And you've got all this, and it just went on and on about, you're only going to be here for a year. And I knew that going in. I was only going to be there for a year. And sure enough, that's how long I was there. Guess what? That kind of impacted the way that we chose to live there, with some of the relationships and some of the attachments. Because when you go into a place knowing that you're only going to be there for so long, it's kind of hard to put down emotional ties with people, right? Well, think about this in the application. Listen, we're not always going to be here. There's a better place coming. The Lord is going to return. That should impact the way that we lead our life every day. Listen, we should know we're headed to a better place. We should live this life like we know our inheritance is real, and that we know there is nothing here in this life that could possibly be any better than what we're going to be getting when the life to come appears. Now, when is Jesus coming back? Well, Matthew 24:36 gives us the answer. Not even Jesus knows. Only the Father knows, according to this passage. But here's something else. And brothers and sisters, I've been reading 1 Peter for my whole life, just about, since I could read and growing up in the church. And I just read this again on Friday, and it jumped off the page to me. Even though Jesus doesn't know when the return is coming, notice what 1 Peter 4:5 says. It says he is ready to judge the living and the dead. Even though Jesus doesn't know, he's ready to come. And when God tells him it's time, there will be no delay, there will be no putting it off, he'll be on his way. Jesus is ready to judge the living and the dead. So the point is, we don't need to get too attached to this life. We don't need to get attached to its politics and its possessions and its relationships, because everything here is moving rapidly toward its end. I read this somewhere on Friday, and I think it's really good. If New Testament Christians were told to live with constant expectation, and we're living 2,000 years later, then how much nearer are we to the return of our Lord? There's an expectation, there's an urgency with this. And I need to live every day in light of that. Now, that's the catalyst for my faithful living, because I don't know when Jesus is going to return, so I need to be faithful. Here are some directives while I live here. And this is found in the second part of verse 7 through the first part of verse 11. And basically, as you look here, this section breaks down nicely into 3 parts. We'll be talking about them. Directives for faithful living include maintaining a holy relationship with God, sustaining loving relationships with others, and living a life of service. In fact, this whole section here is about how you lead your life as a Christian. I mean, it's a great summary of it. Everything in these verses is talking about day-to-day living. It's talking about building good spiritual habits. It's talking about building strength spiritually. But these directions summarize the entirety of the Christian life. And so let's talk about this important thing of living in a holy relationship with God. Let's look at the second part of verse 7. He says, be self-controlled and sober-minded for the sake of your prayers. And so we're going to be filling in the blank here. Obviously, the answer here is self-controlled. What does that mean? Well, simply going back to the Greek dictionaries, it means to keep your head. To keep your head. In a spiritual context, it means to guard, protect, or keep your mind, to fix your mind on what is holy. And I want to connect this. Go back. We're going to have to look in actually use our Bibles for a second. I want to go back to Titus chapter 2 for just a second. And notice how, if you connect what Peter is saying here, living sober-mindedly, living with self-control, notice what he says in Titus 2 and verse 11. He says, the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation for all people, training us to renounce ungodliness and worldly passions, and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in the present age, waiting for our blessed hope, the appearing of the glory of our great God and Savior Jesus Christ. Doesn't that passage in Titus 2 tie in nicely with what we're talking about here in 1 Peter chapter 4? And the question is am I living with that type of mindset? Listen, the idea here is to see everything in its right way with the proper priorities and perspectives. Let's go on. He says not only to be self-controlled, but we need to be sober-minded. That means to be in control of your thoughts, to be watchful, or to be on the alert. Now, why is this so important? Why do I need to be moving with self-control? Why do I need to be in charge of my thoughts? Well, notice the end of the verse. For the sake of your prayers. Peter, as he writes through this epistle, he seems to be very concerned about the prayer life of the saints. And in fact, what he's trying to teach here is that if you get your mind off track through worldly lusts and pursuits, if you get your mind off track by being dominated by your emotions or out of control passions, then you cannot have full fellowship with God through prayer. Wow. That should get our attention. Notice the point here, brothers and sisters. Effective prayer is directly tied to a life of holiness that's characterized by sobriety and sound judgment. And for Peter, prayer is his lifeline. It's something that he's very concerned about. If you go back to chapter 3 and verse 11, he's worried about people's prayers becoming hindered. Listen, if your marriage has gone south, you're not doing right in your marriage, Peter talks about your prayers being hindered. And then if you look at chapter 4 and verse 7, notice here that the word prayers is in the plural. So what he's talking about here is a repeated, ongoing pattern of life. So a life of holiness is something that's got to define me as God's son or daughter. And not only that, but a life of loving relationships is something that God wants me in order to be faithful. Look, if you're looking at verse 7, everything in verse 7 is, the focus is vertical. It's looking up to God. It's considering our relationship to God. Now, beginning in verse 8, everything becomes horizontal, where we're looking toward others, and especially our brethren. And I want to put verse 8 on the screen. Let's focus on this just for a second. Keep loving one another earnestly. That word earnestly. I got to digging around, looking at some dictionaries. I didn't know this before. I had in my mind, my own personal connotation of what this word involves. It was interesting to go back in the original language. The word in the original language means to be stretched out or to be extended as a rope at full tension, reaching out as far as one can to the limit of one's capacity. Love one another earnestly. Not with complacency, not with minimal action, but with strained, stretchable intensity. That's the imagery behind this verse. And so then the question is, well, how do I do this? How do I love some other person like that? What does this look like practically? Well, it means that I've got to rise above, I've got to transcend all the emotional barriers that are in my mind and heart. I'm going to have to learn to love those who are unlovable. I'm going to have to learn to love my enemies. I'm going to have to learn to love those who have walked over me. I'm going to have to learn to love those who have injured me, rejected me, subjected me to unkind treatment, misjudged me, misrepresented me, or mistreated me. That is what Peter is talking about here. And I want to stress another passage that we've referred to quite a bit over the last 6 weeks. It's in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, where Paul here gives us the definition of love. He says it's patient, it's kind, it doesn't envy, it doesn't boast, it's not arrogant, it's not rude, it doesn't insist on its own way. Love is not irritable or resentful. It doesn't rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Look at verse 7. Brothers and sisters, we need to be listening to this passage. We need to be applying this passage. Love bears all things. Love believes all things. Love hopes all things. And love endures all things. That, brothers and sisters, is the application of what Peter is talking about in verse 8 when he says, keep loving one another earnestly. And why do we do that? Look again at verse 7 here on the screen. Read it one more time. As you read that, now what I want you to do is make the application back to verse 8. Why do we do all of this? Why do I love one another earnestly? Well, because love covers a multitude of sins. You know, if we don't have this type of love in our family, we're in real trouble. I mean, real trouble. If we don't have this type of love in the church, we're going to find this church to be soon in decline. And here's what we've got to remember. Not a one of us sitting in this room are perfect. Not a one of us. We are going to sin against one another. I've been here 9 years. And I guarantee you there have been things in relationships that I've had with you where I've messed up. Because I'm human. Well, guess what? I'm not alone. Right? It's going to happen in our relationships. And the only way to overcome all of that is through earnest love for one another. Love is something that forgives and forgives and forgives and forgives and forgives. And listen, that is the heart of God's church, being so overflowing with love that it covers sin. Now listen, I'm not talking about ignoring sin by winking at it or pretending it doesn't exist or allowing unrepentant sin to go on. I'm not talking about that. But the covering here is going to happen when we deal with it properly. Listen, I've been around long enough to see that if we're not careful, we can find ourselves more eager to point out the sins of others and their shortcomings rather than cover them. David Helm, in his writing, comments on this verse in this way. Love takes the oxygen out of sin the way that a blanket chokes the air from one caught on fire. Similarly, as long as oxygen is present, forest fires rage. But if we could take the air away, the blaze would settle down and great tracts of land would be saved. May we love in this way. May nothing evil be allowed to breathe for long. May we keep short accounts. The last days demand our sincere love. That's the essence of what Peter's talking about there. And notice verse 9. This is the practical application of verse 8. Show hospitality to one another without grumbling. And if you read today's bulletin article, I kind of expounded a little bit more on this. But what we're talking about here is the love of strangers. That's what the word hospitality means. And it is basically the opening of our hearts and our homes for those who are in need. And again, verse 9 is the practical way you apply verse 8. But listen, there is more. I think in our minds, when we hear the word hospitality, there's a certain imagery that comes to mind. And I want to dispel that, because this is not just about fixing lunch for someone or allowing someone to stay in our home, which, by the way, we really need to give consideration to how we're doing with that, because that is a part of it. But the bigger idea, the idea of loving people outside of our normal circle. For 8 years, the Kettering Church has not had an evening service. It will soon be 8 years. And I have traveled around the country over the last 8 years. I've had elderships call me, ask me why we did what we did. What do you think about what you did? Would you do it over again? And so on and so forth. But a lot of you that are sitting here today weren't here 8 years ago when we made the decision to cancel Sunday night services. But do you remember what we said and why we were going to do it? The idea was to help us all to associate Christianity with something outside of the church building, where we were encouraging you to use the free time on Sunday afternoon, not for your own time, not to go out and play sports or do your own thing, but to spend that time with brethren. To spend that time getting to know one another more and more and more, and to spend that time encouraging one another. Now let me ask you, 8 years in, how are we doing with that? Seriously, how are we doing with that? Listen, I love the extra time on Sunday afternoon, Sunday evenings. I think it's great. But there was a purpose behind what we did, and part of that purpose goes back to this passage right here in verse 9. Opening our homes and our hearts, stretching ourselves in our relationships, spending time with one another, encouraging one another, because listen, we live in a world that is rapidly running away from God. This verse is all about generous hospitality toward those that we don't know that well. It's about opening our hearts for them. Now, the other direction here is in verses 10 and 11, and that is live a life of service. So I want you to think about the progression so far in verses 7 through 10. A right relationship leads to one loving one another earnestly, which leads to a life of faithful service. Do you see the progression? But here's something else. Spiritual service without inward holiness, spiritual service without outward love, is nothing more than hypocrisy. It's nothing more than legalism. And that's why I spent the time today. We're talking about service this month at Kettering. You may be wondering, why, Matt, have you spent all this time in the verses leading up to the 2 verses that actually talk about service? Well, because if we don't get the first 2 things right, a relationship with God and a love for others right, then the service means nothing. It counts for nothing. It's fake Christianity. We like to use that term, fake news, fake this, fake that. Well, how about fake Christianity? There's a lot of fake Christians out there. So look at verse 10. And I'm going to look at the middle part of the verse before I go back to the beginning of the verse. And what we're going to do for the next 5 minutes or so is just pull these 2 verses apart. This should go pretty fast. But what are we talking about? We talk about serving one another. Notice there, use the gift to serve one another. Well, basically that word means to wait on someone. Think of a busboy at a restaurant. I mean, really, that's what Peter has in mind there. It's something that's menial. It's something that's basic. There's really not a lot of glory in it. But the imperative here is that we live out our lives serving one another. And listen, while I should be willing to serve everyone, those within and without the body, the main emphasis in this text is on those inside the body of Christ. Now, go back with me, if you will, and look at the beginning of verse 10. As each has received a gift. As each, every Christian has a gift. 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 7 says that every believer has one. Spiritual gifts have been universally bestowed. And then in verse 11 of the same chapter, Paul says that spiritual gifts have been given individually. The gifts you have are unique for you. They're one of a kind. There is no one else like you. And sometimes we may fail to miss that if we look at the spiritual gifts that are listed out in Romans 12 and 1 Corinthians 12, and we fail to see them as broad categories. What Peter's talking about here, imagine a painter who has a palette in front of him with basic colors. And then he takes his brush and he mixes those colors and he puts that on the canvas and he makes up a unique painting that is like no other that's ever been painted before. God is doing that with you. God takes his brush and he paints you in a very unique way. Listen, you are not the same as everyone else. You bring your own experience, you bring your own background, your own opportunities, your own influences, your own environment. God provides us with gifts of differing measures, according to Ephesians 4. He provides us with different measures of faith to employ those gifts, according to Romans chapter 12 and verse 3. And so all those things work together to make you useful in the kingdom. But notice there, each one has received, I got behind on my slides there, we've received the gift. Each has received it. You didn't earn it. You didn't generate it. You received it. Ephesians 4 says Jesus gave you the gift. It's a gift of grace. And notice there at the end, you have received a gift. It's a way of ministry. That's what a gift is. It's a way of ministry. It is a service. And I want you to connect in with Ephesians 4, 11 and 12. Why did God give us spiritual leaders? Remember that passage? God gave us teachers and shepherds and evangelists to equip the saints for the work of ministry. Leaders equip, saints serve. Your gift is what you do when the Spirit calls you to minister to the body in a way that produces a positive impact. So you have received a gift, and notice as you keep going here, you are a good steward of that gift. See the obligation. You're to use your gift to help others, and if you choose not to, you have a negative impact on the local church. The message here is that we're each going to be held responsible for how we manage our gift. Listen, you don't own your gift. Your gift is never about you. Your gift is for the common good. And notice here the word varied. That word means manifold, multicolored. It's the same wording Paul uses in Ephesians chapter 3, verses 10 and 11. And the idea here is the same as what Paul would express in Ephesians 3. God blends everything together to paint you in this unique way, and that's why there is so much diversity in the church. The idea here is no one can take your place. Use your gifts to serve others. That's the message. And then notice verse 11. Notice there are two types of gifts. There are speaking gifts. Do you see that there in verse 11? And there are serving gifts. I've been reading this for years and years, and I never really saw that until I read some writing earlier in the week. Two types of gifts there. Whoever speaks, whoever serves. Speaking gifts might be the gift of preaching, might be teaching, might be someone able that is to speak words of encouragement, somebody that's gifted in leadership or sharing knowledge and experience gained. And then there are serving gifts, people who have the ability to pray for others, people who can serve in administration or visit others or to help others. But notice also the admonition here. The admonition is that if you have the speaking gift, you speak as the oracles of God. If you have the serving gift, you serve by the strength that God supplies. So 3 directives for faithful living there in that section. And finally, real quickly, the purpose for faithful living is at the end of the verse. We do all these things, notice, that in order that in everything God may be glorified through Jesus Christ. That's why we do all of this. This is the goal in all that we do. You are no longer living for yourself. You are living for the one who saved you. So here we have the catalyst, we have directives, and we have the purpose for faithful living. All 4 spelled out here clearly in 1 Peter 4, 7 through 11. Brothers and sisters, for generations in the Lord's church, we have emphasized what is necessary for salvation. We have emphasized faith and repentance and especially baptism. And while this is something that is absolutely scriptural, we may have, if we're not careful, emphasized these things to the point of the view where some may begin to view these things as an end. I have faith, I have repented, I have been baptized, therefore I am good to go. And I will pay in the giving every week for someone else to do the work that God has called me to do. I have done my part. Now, we may have inadvertently created that. And I don't think that's the case here at Kettering. But it could be in other places. And we need to guard against that here. Someone who says, well, I've got faith in Jesus, I've walked away from my old life, I've been baptized, I'm good to go. And what happens is we have Christians that are sitting in the pews who have coasted with more concern for themselves than others. Listen, service for them is what we pay church leaders to do. I literally heard that in one place I used to preach. We're paying you to do this. I think it was somebody was in the hospital, and for whatever reason I couldn't go, and one of the brothers piped up in the business and he said, well, we're paying you to do that. Well, wow. I hadn't forgot that one. But that's the mentality. Listen, faith, repentance, and baptism are not an end. Passages like what we've studied here this morning are powerful in the fact that they remind us all of our own directives, our own responsibilities, our own stake in the church. You have a stake, you have a place, you have a role here to play in the Kettering family. And God is calling you to serve one another. Use that gift that He's given you in a way that brings Him glory. And guess what happens? The entire body here will grow and be edified through you. Somebody says, I don't know what to do. I don't know what my place is. There is a place for you here. And God will show you your talents and the gifts as you serve Him. What about you? Are you in the family? Are you part of God's family? Where are you in your spiritual life? Are you living every day in light of the possibility that Jesus could return? You know, there's a chance that we couldn't even finish out today, Sunday, May the 5th. The Lord may part the skies this afternoon and it's over. And if that were to happen, are you ready to meet Him in the air? What is the condition of your soul? Now's a good time to be thinking about that. And if there's any question that if He were to return this afternoon, or that, God forbid, you were to die tonight, if there's any question about where your eternal destiny would be, if there's any question about whether you would actually rise to meet Him in the air, then now is the time to get your life right. Do it. Be oversure, be double sure. Because if you wait too long and you miss heaven, you missed it all. So can we serve you right now? All things are ready. We're going to be singing an invitation song. Just come forward while we sing this song, and we'll see to your needs. If you're subject anyway, why don't you come forward as we stand and sing.